let's try something for a second. Imagine that what we're about to go through isn't just a list of historical facts. Think of it more like a blueprint. A blueprint that doesn't just show what happened during the war in the Pacific, but one that reveals why it happened. And, believe it or not, why it still has a direct impact on you right now today. We're going to dive into the story of how a nation, a proud and powerful one, went to war not just against an enemy military, but against the very idea of the modern factory, the assembly line itself. And they lost. Badly. So this isn't just a history lesson. It's a really profound story about facing reality. Okay, you ready? Let's get into it. Just listen to these words for a moment. We were fighting the ocean itself. This is coming from a man named Admiral Toichi Hara. This isn't some poet or a philosopher. This is a warrior, a man who commanded a cruiser division, who fought in 7 major naval battles, who dedicated his entire life to the Imperial Japanese Navy. And this wasn't something he bragged about in the heat of battle. No, this was a confession, something he wrote down in a cold prison cell in Tokyo, December 1945, after it was all over. What you're hearing in that sentence is the sound of a man's worldview shattering. It's this dawning, absolutely horrific realization that their enemy, it wasn't just men and ships. It was something endless, something that could replace everything they destroyed faster than they could even count their own victories. They thought they were in a naval war. They found out way too late they were fighting an industrial ocean. So let me paint a picture for you. The war's over. Tokyo is just rubble, and inside the walls of Sugamo Prison, the top American military minds aren't just there to interrogate prisoners of war. They're doing something much bigger. They're conducting a massive, systematic audit of the entire war. It was called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. And those interrogation rooms, they basically became confessionals. For the first time, Japan's highest-ranking leaders, the generals, the admirals, the politicians, were being forced to look at the numbers. The statistics, the cold, hard data they had waved away for years. And they had to explain, in their own words, how they led their entire nation into a fight that, mathematically, they could never, ever have won. To really get our heads around this colossal miscalculation, we have to rewind. We have to go back to before a single bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, because the real seeds of Japan's defeat weren't sown on some bloody beach. They were sown in quiet conference rooms, in the minds of leaders who were given clear, undeniable warnings, and who chose to believe in a national myth instead. This is the story of what happens when clear, factual data goes up against a powerful, passionate belief, and the belief wins. Okay, so this is Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He is famously the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack. But here is the massive, incredible irony of it all. He was maybe the one guy in the entire Japanese high command who knew from the very beginning that the war was a lost cause. And why? Because unlike the others, he had actually seen America. He wasn't just reading reports. He'd studied at Harvard. He served as a naval attaché in Washington. You have to picture this. He literally walked the floors of the auto factories in Detroit. He saw the sheer scale of the oil fields in Texas. This quote you're looking at isn't something he said after the war. This is from a personal letter in 1941. It's a desperate warning, a plea to his own government. He was the prophet who saw the numbers, and he was terrified. And then you have this. This is the other side of the coin. This is the voice of the establishment, Admiral Osamu Nagano, and he's speaking directly to the emperor. And just listen to that language. He calls American workers soft. He's dismissing an entire civilization's industrial might with a simple caricature. This right here, this is the core of the whole tragedy laid bare. You have Yamamoto's realism, which was based on first-hand observation and hard data, versus Nagano's blind faith in something intangible. This idea of the Yamato spirit, the unbreakable fighting soul of Japan, that he believed could somehow make up for a massive, massive disadvantage in steel and oil. It was a beautiful, heroic, and, as it turns out, an utterly fatal idea. And this chart right here, this is the proof. This is the data they were looking at. This isn't some analysis we did a week ago. These are the numbers that the Japanese Navy Ministry's own intelligence teams had in their hands in 1941. And just look at them. Steel production? The U.S. is outproducing Japan by nearly 4-1. Okay, that's bad. But the truly mind-blowing number, the one that should have stopped everything, is oil. America was refining 4.3 million barrels a day. Japan? 55,000. That's a ratio of almost 80-1. An aircraft carrier, a battleship, a plane, they're all useless hunks of metal without fuel. This data shows the unbelievable choice they made to look at these facts and basically say, nope, doesn't matter, our will is stronger.
So let's just hit pause for a second, because this brings up a really critical question, and it's not just about Japan in 1941, it's about leadership, period. Why would smart, experienced people look at their own verified intelligence, the cold, hard numbers that their own people gathered, and just choose to ignore it? Is it about national pride? Is it just the political momentum of the moment, something that's too big to stop? Or is it the danger of starting to believe your own propaganda? It's a deeply human question, and it's one that, frankly, we still see playing out all the time, even today.
All right, so the decision was made. The war began. And pretty quickly, all those numbers they had ignored on paper started showing up in the real world, on the battlefield. And the terrifying thing was, even when Japan was winning, even in their greatest victories, there were these little clues, these hints that their entire strategic foundation was built on sand. The battlefield became a brutal classroom, and the lessons were written in fire and steel. We all know the story of Pearl Harbor. It's seen as this brilliant, devastating Japanese victory, and on a tactical level, it was. But strategically, it was a terrifying look into the sheer depth of American power. The Japanese pilots were hunting for battleships and carriers, but the things they didn't hit were arguably more important. The massive oil tank farms, millions of barrels of fuel for the entire Pacific fleet, they were left completely untouched. The submarine base, undamaged. The ship repair yards, totally functional. One of the attack's main planners, Commander Minoru Genda, said later that what really chilled him was looking down and seeing that the harbor had more support ships, tenders, oilers, supply ships, than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy possessed. He realized they hadn't just hit a naval base. They had just chipped the tiny tip of a massive industrial iceberg. Then you get to the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of '42. And this is where the difference between an industrial power and a regional power just becomes painfully obvious. The American carrier, the USS Yorktown, gets hit hard. She's badly damaged. Japanese intelligence looked at the damage reports and, based on their own capabilities, they figured, okay, she's out of the war for at least 3 months. But the Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor and 1,400 workers swarmed that ship. They worked around the clock, using tools and techniques Japan barely had. They patched her up and got her battle ready in just 72 hours. 3 days. Now contrast that with the Japanese carrier's Shokaku, damaged in the same fight. It took her 11 weeks to get repaired. Think about that. One side can fix a capital ship in 3 days. The other takes almost 3 months. The war wasn't just being fought by sailors at sea. It was being won by welders in the shipyards. And that brings us to the legendary Battle of Midway, the one everyone says turned the tide. Japan lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers. These weren't just ships. They were veteran crews, the absolute best of the best. They were, for all intents and purposes, irreplaceable. But the real story of Midway isn't what Japan lost. It's what America was already building. One of Yamamoto's own staff officers wrote in his diary, "The Americans will replace their losses within a year. We cannot replace ours in 10 years. And honestly, he was being optimistic. Just look at this chart. For the entire rest of the war, Japan only managed to build 3 more big carriers. In that same time, America finished over 17 of just the big Essex-class carriers alone. That's not even counting the dozens and dozens of smaller carriers. The battle wasn't just lost in the skies over Midway. It was lost years before on the slipways of American shipyards. So now we're moving into the mid to late part of the war. And this is where the numbers stop being just statistics on a page and they become something else. They become a force of nature. An avalanche. The full, terrifying, unbelievable power of the American factory was finally unleashed. And it created a gap so huge that things like courage and spirit and skill became tragically almost irrelevant. I just want you to look at this number for a second. 7,200. By the spring of 1943, that's how many military aircraft were rolling off American assembly lines every single month. Try to wrap your head around that. That's not over a year, that's in 30 days. It's an air force larger than what most nations on the planet had in total, being created from scratch every single month. It wasn't a war of production anymore. It was a flood. And the contrast is just brutal. Japan, pushing its industry to the absolute breaking point, managed to produce 650 planes in that same month. The math is simple, and it's horrifying. For every single plane Japan built, America built more than 10. And that changes everything. It means that for Japan, every pilot they lost was a national tragedy, an expert that took years to train and was almost impossible to replace. For America, every plane they lost was a replaceable part, an inventory item that was already being replaced tenfold on an assembly line somewhere in Kansas or California. The war in the air was already over. It was just a matter of time.
And it wasn't just about the sheer number of things being built. It was about a level of technology that was almost like science fiction to the Japanese. Take this, the B-29 Superfortress. America built nearly 4,000 of them. But get this, the program just to develop this one airplane cost $3 billion. That's more money than Japan spent on its entire military for a whole year. This one plane. These things had pressurized cabins so they could fly higher than any Japanese fighter could reach. They had computer-controlled guns. It was a weapon that came from a completely different economic and technological universe.
And this is what that feels like on a human level. These weren't just abstract figures. Japanese naval intelligence was getting these production reports from the US, and the numbers were so shocking, so demoralizing, that they were classified above top secret, basically hidden from their own government. This quote from Rear Admiral Taki says everything. This is a top-level officer at the Naval General Staff, admitting in private what nobody dared to say out loud. And the real tragedy? The numbers weren't half true. They were actually conservative. The reality was even worse than his worst nightmare. They had already lost the war. The fighting just hadn't stopped yet. So we've seen the fatal miscalculation. We've seen the absolute, overwhelming defeat. But the story does not end there. In fact, you could argue that the most incredible part of this story starts in the ruins. This is where that blueprint for fighting the American factory was picked up, dusted off, and completely flipped around. It became the blueprint for building a new Japan. This is the amazing, unexpected legacy of their total defeat. Think about this for a second. The very same officers who were being interrogated in Sugamo prison, the men who were forced to stare at the numbers of their own failure, they became the unlikely architects of Japan's post-war economic miracle. They had seen American efficiency firsthand. They understood the logistical genius it took to supply an army across the Pacific. So they took that same systems thinking, that obsession with logistics and efficiency, and they applied it to building cars and cameras and electronics for companies like Toyota and Sony. They took the lessons from their worst defeat and used them to build a new kind of empire. And this transformation happened at a stunning speed. In 1945, Japan's industrial base is nothing but ash. But the knowledge they gained from the war, that's still there. By 1950, they're hungry for new ideas. They embrace the ideas of an American statistician named W. Edwards Deming, who teaches them about quality control, methods that, ironically, American companies were mostly ignoring at the time. This relentless focus on quality and improvement meant that by the 1970s, Made in Japan wasn't a punchline anymore. It was a mark of excellence. And by the 1980s, Japan had achieved through commerce what it never could through conquest. It became a true global economic superpower. They had finally truly learned the lesson of the factory. And this was the ultimate lesson. This was the payoff. The core belief that had led them into the disaster in the first place, this idea that spirit could conquer material reality, was totally replaced by a new understanding. They discovered that in the modern world, real, sustainable power, it doesn't come from the warrior. It flows from the factory floor. It comes from the efficiency of the assembly line. It comes from the hands of the worker. They learned to speak the language of statistics, and they used it to rebuild their entire world. And that brings us right back to today. The car you might drive, the phone in your pocket, the TV in your living room, so many of them are a direct result of this incredible story. And it leaves us with this one final, powerful thought to consider. In our own lives, in our own countries today, what do we really value more? The heroic story of the individual fighting against impossible odds? Or the collective, often invisible power of the millions of workers and engineers and organizers who actually build the world around us? This history seems to suggest that while the spirit of the warrior makes for great stories, it's the hands of the worker that actually build reality.